Bright as crayon wax. Wrinkled like an old man's knuckle. It snaps when you bite it raw and floods your tongue with something sharp, almost electric, the exact same pucker you get from biting into a sour candy. Leave it in full sunlight for 3 days and that sharpness softens into something warm and sweet, almost fruity, like a cross between an apple and a freshly dug new potato. It grows at altitudes where wheat dies gasping. It thrives in soil that the common potato considers an insult. It fed 12 million people for 8,000 years without a single bag of fertilizer. So why have you never heard of it? The answer is not a disease. It is not a drought. It is not even a war, though a war is part of the story. The answer is a decision made 500 years ago by men on horseback who needed obedience more than nutrition. And that single decision erased one of the most resilient food crops the world has ever produced. This is OCA, Oxalis tuberosa, the second most important tuber crop in the Andes, second only to the potato. A plant that still grows in colors no grocery shelf has ever displayed: crimson, gold, apricot, cream, deep violet. A plant that farmers in Bolivia and Peru still protect in kitchen gardens because their grandmothers told them never to let it go. It almost conquered Europe. It almost replaced the potato in the years of famine. It never did. And the reason why is a story about empire, convenience, and exactly what gets sacrificed when a civilization stops valuing complexity. Ocea's story does not begin with Columbus. It does not begin with the Inca. It begins somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, in the cold, thin air above Lake Titicaca, on the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia, where Quechua and Aymara farmers noticed wild oxalis plants producing small, edible tubers and began selecting the best ones year after year, season after season, generation after generation. For context, that is older than the wheel, older than the written alphabet, older than most of the civilizations whose ruins we study in school. By the time the Inca Empire reached its height in the 15th century, oca had already been cultivated for longer than Rome existed, expanded, and collapsed. It was not a secondary crop. It was a strategic one. Incan farmers planted oca above the potato line, at elevations exceeding 4,000 meters, in marginal soils where nothing commercially valuable would grow. While the potato anchored the lower terraces, oca anchored the high slopes, creating a food security system so layered and redundant that no single frost, no single crop failure could bring the entire civilization to its knees. This was not accident. This was agricultural engineering, carried out over generations without universities, without laboratories, without a single peer-reviewed journal. But before we get to why it disappeared, we need to understand what made it worth keeping for 8,000 years. Bite a freshly harvested oca raw, and the first sensation is brightness. A sharp, citrus-forward zing that crackles across the sides of your tongue. Crisp in texture, like a carrot crossed with a radish. In Mexico, where oca is still eaten raw in markets, it is served simply, sliced thin, dusted with salt, chili, and lime, eaten as an afternoon snack. But oca has a trick no other tuber on Earth possesses. Leave the harvested tubers outside in direct sunlight for 3 to 5 days and a chemical transformation occurs. The oxalic acid that gives oca its sharp, sour punch begins to break down. The starches begin converting to sugars. What started as an almost aggressive, puckering bite shifts into something genuinely sweet, warm, and nutty. Andean farmers have called this sunbathing for generations. It requires no tools, no technology, no energy input, only patience and a clear sky. The transformation is so dramatic that the same tuber tastes like two entirely different vegetables before and after exposure to the sun. Raw from the ground, sour candy. 4 days on a stone wall in the light, something closer to a sweet potato crossed with a chestnut. No other crop in the European or North American agricultural tradition behaves this way. The Andean relationship with oca did not stop at fresh eating. The most demanding varieties, those with the highest concentrations of oxalic acid and too sour for direct consumption, were engineered into a long-term preserved product, the quechua called kaya. The process is ancient and precise. Harvested tubers are submerged in cold water, sometimes running stream water, for up to 1 month. This leaches out the sharpest acids. The tubers are then removed and laid on the high-altitude ground, exposed to the freeze of nights when temperatures drop below zero, and then to the fierce Andean sun of the day, repeatedly for several weeks. The moisture evaporates, the cell walls collapse. What remains is a shrunken, chalk-like disc that weighs almost nothing and can be stored without refrigeration for years. Some accounts say decades. This is freeze-drying, not invented in a 20th century laboratory. It was invented on the Andean plateau by farmers who understood that the atmosphere at 4,000 meters, with its daily swing between freezing darkness and burning light, was a natural preservation machine running on no fuel at all. Kaya was famine insurance, a compact, shelf-stable carbohydrate that could sit in a storehouse and keep an entire community alive through a volcanic winter, a drought, or a collapsed harvest. And what exactly was in those tubers that made them worth preserving so carefully? 100 grams of oca delivers nearly 40 milligrams of vitamin C, more than 60% of an adult's daily requirement. Some varieties, depending on soil and altitude, provide iron levels reaching 70% of the daily value per serving. Oca also contains meaningful amounts of zinc, vitamin B2 and riboflavin. The fiber content outpaces the common potato by a substantial margin. At approximately 30 kilocalories per 100 grams, it is one of the low-calorie tubers on record. You are not trading nutrition for lightness. You are getting a compact, micronutrient-dense food that grows without irrigation, without synthetic inputs, without tilling machinery. The Andean farmers who maintained OCA did not need a printed nutrition label. They understood it through survival. The villages that kept oca rotating alongside potato were the ones that outlasted drought years and frost years. The ones that abandoned it eventually learned the cost. In 1830, oca arrived in Europe with considerable fanfare. Botanists and agricultural societies in both France and England believed they had found the next great salvation crop. The Royal Horticultural Society of London included it in official trials. French agricultural journals published enthusiastic reports on the truffet acide, called the acid truffle in Paris markets. By the 1840s, as the Irish potato famine killed over 1 million people and forced 1 million more from their homes, voices in Britain and Ireland were already arguing that oca should have been established alongside the potato years earlier. The crop was documented. It was already growing in trial gardens. The door was open. It closed. Here is what the excited agricultural journals did not explain clearly because it was too inconvenient. OCA is a short-day plant. It does not begin forming tubers until the days shorten below a specific threshold, roughly 12 hours of daylight. Near the equator in the Andes, this triggers reliably in autumn. In Europe, at higher latitudes, this trigger arrives late. Farmers planting oca in spring watched an entire growing season pass, while the plant leafed beautifully above ground and did almost nothing below. The tubers only began to swell meaningfully in October and November, leaving no margin before the killing frosts of December arrived. Yields were inconsistent, timing was unforgiving, and unlike a potato that tolerates weeks in cold, damp soil after maturity, oca's thin skin and high moisture content meant that a tuber left too long in wet autumn ground rotted quickly. Once harvested, fresh oca does not keep like a potato. You have days to use it, not months to sell it. For subsistence farmers already working at the edge of survival, a crop demanding precise timing and offering no room for storage margin was not a revolution. It was one more problem to solve with no room for error. Industrial agriculture made the verdict permanent. By the late 19th century, the agricultural economies of Europe and North America were reorganizing entirely around scale, standardization, and the railroad network. A commercially viable crop needed to be harvested at a predictable window, stored for months in warehouses, shipped across continents without spoilage, and sold at a uniform size and appearance. OCA failed every single requirement. It could not be patented. It reproduced from saved tubers. Farmers simply kept their own stock from year to year. Seed companies had no commercial reason to develop it. Agricultural research institutions directed funding toward crops with export potential and compatibility with machine harvest. Oca received no breeding programs, no cold chain infrastructure was built around it, no agronomist was paid to solve its timing problem. By the early 20th century, it had vanished from European agricultural catalogues entirely. The plant did not know it was obsolete. It simply stopped being ordered. New Zealand kept it. Oca arrived in New Zealand around 1860, carried by settlers from South America. Unlike in Europe, New Zealand's climate, its autumn light cycles and its mild and predictable frosts suited Oca's photo-period requirements closely enough to produce consistent harvests. New Zealand gardeners adopted it, called it the New Zealand yam, and wove it into local food culture so thoroughly that it still appears in produce markets and home gardens today. In Peru and Bolivia, it never left. Quechua and Aymara farmers maintained hundreds of distinct varieties across thousands of household gardens, passing tubers down through generations not as a commercial transaction, but as a form of living memory, edible knowledge kept alive in the soil. At least 800 cultivated varieties are documented today, each a slightly different answer to a different altitude, soil type, or seasonal rhythm. 800 varieties, maintained in total obscurity, on marginal land. By farmers, the industrial food system never once thought to consult. The climate scientists and food security researchers now looking seriously at OCA are not doing so out of romanticism. They are doing so because the conditions OCA was bred to survive are the precise conditions the world is entering. Erratic rainfall, shortened frost-free windows, soils degraded by decades of chemical dependency. Oca grows in acidic soil with pH levels between 5.3 and 7.8 where nothing profitable will grow. It needs no synthetic fertilizer. When the harvest comes in, it can be preserved using nothing but cold night air and morning sun, and stored without electricity for years. Oca was not abandoned because it failed. It was abandoned because it was built for a world that was unpredictable, marginal, and harsh. It was the world industrial agriculture claimed it had permanently solved. It had not solved it. It had only deferred the cost. The bill is now arriving. The Andean farmer who still tucks oca tubers into the same high-altitude soil her grandmother worked is not being stubborn. She is not being sentimental. She is being precise. She understands something the catalogue writers, the seed companies, and the agricultural institutions never did. Some crops are not made for the market. They are made for the long survival. And the difference between those two things is exactly what we are spending the 21st century learning to calculate again. If you have ever reached for something sharp and bright to cut through the ordinary, if that sour candy snap is the flavor that wakes you up, you already understand what oca is. You just never knew what to call it. If you want to see it growing in a pot on your own balcony or windowsill, drop a comment below. Tell us where you are in the world and let us know if you want to follow up on growing it at home. If the story of the crops that fed empires and outlasted everything except our own convenience is a story that matters to you, subscribe. We are just getting started.